I think about this cycle with like investing and financial stuff, right? If you look at the stock markets, you look at real estate, you look at everything is on a cycle. And if you pay attention to history and you understand cycle and you understand the laws of nature, you understand that those cycles have high periods and low periods. And you might be in a really, really high period and just understand that might not last forever. All right, what is up? Episode 39 of Pursuit of Balance. We're going to talk about some, this is going to be a hippie conversation from Corey. I think about this all the time when I'm out in life and nature, and I was like, you know what? I think this could be an episode. I can make this work. So I'm going to talk about today what nature can teach us in life, right? And like I mentioned, it's just like one of those things every time I'm at the beach or I'm mountain biking or I'm outside, I'm like, there's just so many laws of nature that if we really pay attention to them, we can learn. And I think, I use them a lot as analogies to people when I'm explaining, in coaching or if I'm in an assessment with somebody. I always like to kind of use them. I'm a big analogy guy. So I thought I'd share with you guys, right? And I just kind of wrote down 8 things. I kind of wrote a bonus one at the bottom. And, and I think about this in the parallels of like, one of my probably top 5, maybe top 5, top 10 book for me was Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene, right? And, and I just think about that, the word itself, human nature, that nature is something that we all have in us, right? And nature is obviously most of us just kind of think about as the forest, the beach, the outside world, right? And it's interesting that we even just perceive it as the outside world because the reality of it is like we live in nature, and we've just gentrified everywhere we live to make it feel like we're in cities and we're in our house and we're behind screens. And, it's obviously a huge piece when I think about the stress management part of my coaching, the sleep management, even the mindsets, the happiness level that you have, the optimizing health part of it. Spending more time in nature has so many benefits, right? And I'm not going to talk so much about what does nature directly benefit our health for. Today, like I said, as I want to the laws of nature, right? The things that nature, if you really pay attention to how they work and how they actually can influence your life or, like I said, using it as an analogy for situations in life is kind of what I really wanted to focus on today. So number 1, right off the top, there's seasons, right? So I wrote there's seasons of life and every season serves a purpose, and I think a lot of times most of us expect to live in this summer all the time, right? And I use that, and you're going to hear me say a lot of analogies today, so you have to just bear with me. When I say that we want to live in summers, we always want to live with the weather is perfect, things are good, the weather's warm, I can spend my time outside, I can go. When I think about my nutrition coaching, there is, some degree of coaching around changing someone's diet or calorie count based off seasons, right? And why I say that is because if you think about you as an individual, granted here I'm filming in Mountain View, California, so the Bay Area, our winters can get a little cold. Not super cold, but they can get pretty cold. So you're less active, you're spending less time outside, you're getting less sun exposure, and all those things in return should mean that you should probably eat less calories to accommodate for the lack of movement or less movement overall. So that's like a real example of how I actually change someone's kind of approach to health or nutrition, whatever it might be, based off a season, right? What I'm saying here is the analogy of their seasons to life is understand that there's going to be periods of restoration. There's going to be periods that we need to slow it down. There's going to be periods that we need to have time for reflection. Then there's going to be periods of time where there's growth. There's going to be periods of time where we're starting to transition into a new chapter of life, right? We're starting to work our way up into a new business endeavor or, I have a kid coming, right? So when I think about that with kind of like this spring analogy, right? Of things growing back and flourishing and getting ready for summer, right? And then as you go through the cycle back through fall, right? Like fall, it's we think about all the leaves are falling down, the trees are shedding, we're shedding all the old stuff. So I like to think about this all the time because that cycle of life is something that we can apply personally to ourselves, right? When we choose to think that we can just chase the sun and live in summer all the time, well, you technically could, as far as living situations go. What happens is you end up missing all the recovery. You end up missing the time for reflection. You end up missing the ability to kind of shed off the fat and get on the new stuff that we need to kind of spring forward with, right? So that's the first one I use because I do think about this all the time. Second one is the sun is always shining above the clouds, right? And Probably use this quote or analogy or statement a handful of times when people are feeling more stressed out, right? Or feeling a certain type of way as far as emotions go. And that could be both fear, that could be sadness, that could be anger. And I say your joy, your purpose, your light, they're still always above the clouds, meaning, and I use clouds as the analogy for lessons, right? That no matter how dark it is, no matter how rainy it is, no matter how windy it is, there is always sun shining above everything that we're dealing with. And I like to think about this as kind of like, I use the lighthouse analogy a lot, or this kind of guiding light that no matter how dark the storm is that you're in, there is always sun above, right? And, another thing I wrote down is elevation changes your perspective, right? If you guys have ever flown before, you've taken off or it's cloudy or it looks like it's rainy or it looks like it's shitty weather, and at a certain amount of feet in the air, all of a sudden it's like, holy shit, I'm above the clouds, right? I can see the sun. It's a very different perspective overall, right? So I use that a lot on these emotional kind of periods of life, right? That like we need to remind ourselves that at the end of the day, no matter the season of life that you're in, or no matter the situation that you're in, that it doesn't last forever, right? Like it will not, quote unquote, rain every day. It will not be dark every day. There could be periods where it's dark and rainy and shitty for days. It could be weeks. It could feel like months, and for some situations in life, maybe not the quote unquote the weather, but like it could feel like years sometimes, right? But always the reminder that I use for myself is no matter what, I will get out of this period. I will get out of this season. I will transition into something new. And no matter how hard it is or how low I feel, I can always just remember that that cycle is cyclical, right? And that will come back the other direction. Number 3, nature recovers every single time from natural disasters, right? And I think about natural disasters, like I wrote down a couple things of like wildfires, and how they germinate, like certain wildflowers, how volcanoes create the most fertile soil on the earth, right? How pruning plants allows them to grow back stronger and taller, right? So losses create your best opportunities, right? And when you think about this cycle of regeneration, right? And I think about this with the spring analogy and season, right? Or I think about this with natural disasters. It is a very, very normal human response that when you go through your own quote unquote natural disaster, that you feel like it's done forever, right? And that could be a loss of a person, that could be a loss of a job, that could be a loss of an opportunity. When we look at this disaster, something quote unquote burning to the ground, a relationship ending or losing a family member, like these things are going to be hard no matter what. But nature recovers every time, right? And I think about this, like I said, a lot of this episode is going to feel very hippie-ish, so you just have to bear with the hippie mindset that I have. That like, hey, we're going to recover and we're going to grow back stronger, right? I grew up with a mom that spent a lot of time in the garden and the backyard and just landscaping and things like that. I used to always think about that. She's like, I'm like, why are you always trimming these things? She's like, well, when you trim them, they grow back taller, they grow back stronger. It's the whole idea of pruning. And you think about this in life is sometimes all we do is we just add stuff onto our plate, right? But we don't really trim the fat. We don't really prune our lifestyles, right? We don't get things out of the way in order for us to grow taller and stronger too. And you'll see that all these things that I wrote down, all of them can sound the same. All of them can have the same parallels, right? But when I say loss creates opportunity, I remember, I was just thinking about this actually a couple weekends ago. We were in Santa Cruz, my wife and I. And, sometimes I just kind of just go down the rabbit hole and let my brain do its thing. I met my wife at Equinox. I was 23 years old when I got hired there, right? What made me sign or even apply to Equinox was I moved apartments and I was with a buddy and we were partying that night and I had a safe and I had some cash and I remember I got robbed. And I don't think I've ever told this story like online. But I got shit stolen from my room, right? I was gone for a day, lunch, work, whatever it was, came back, my shit was gone. And I was like, what the fuck? You know what I mean? And I had all this cash and whatever. At that time, $10,000, I mean, no matter what, at this time, $10,000 is still a lot of money. And at that time, I was like, fuck, that's like all my money, right? And I remember I was like, you know what? I need to get my life together. In my early 20s, I was partying. I was doing stupid shit. I was jumping from job to job. I was just kind of like living it up. And don't get me wrong, I wouldn't change a thing because I loved that part of my chapter of life and story. But without that happening, I would have never applied to Equinox. Without applying to Equinox and getting the job at Equinox, I would have never met my wife. I would have never met the clients that I still work with, right? So shout out to, my clients, Pat and Mel. Shout out to my clients, Shyla. Shout out to my clients, Sal, who I met through Lucky and from Equinox as well. I've had these people in my life for over 10 years now. And without that, I would have never opened up Functional Lifestyles in Palo Alto. And who knows? You guys, this probably wouldn't even be here without that situation, right? Like, it's just kind of crazy to think about the domino and the domino effect of life, and like how one thing, good or bad, can be the catalyst for change in your life, right? But if you were to ask me during the time when all that stuff happened, I was at a low. I felt like defeated. I felt like, what the fuck am I doing? You know what I mean? And now it's like, obviously, it's funny to look back at it, I don't know how old I am. I think I'm 34, turning 35. So almost 12 years ago now. That it's like, now it's easy to reflect and be like, wow, like, how grateful can I be for this situation, right? Like, that no matter how hard that season was, or no matter how hard that disaster was, I was able to grow back. I was able to become stronger. I was able to become grateful for the things that I do have. And I was able to also understand the reality of, without that, I wouldn't have all this stuff that I have that's so great in my life. I wouldn't have my wife. I wouldn't have my business. And these are probably the two most important things that I have in my life right now, because I care about them so much. And those are both catalysts from those kind of disasters. So, think about that for situations maybe that you guys are in. Okay, the next one, I'm a surfer and skimboarder, so I've always thought about this one when I kind of just sit out there and stare at the waves. I say waves moves in sets, right? And what waves teach us and what taught me is that life has timing and life has rhythm, right? Surfers know to wait versus fighting for every single wave, right? So meaning that, like, patience is a strategy, right? Learning to understand that, one thing that you'll realize about nature, that if I were to zoom out a little bit more, what are the parallels from everything I wrote down? It is the cycles that are created, right? In waves, there's sets, right? And these sets normally come in sets of 4, 6 to 4 to 8 waves at a time. And some sets are bigger than others. Some sets are smaller than others. Some sets are a little bit nastier than others. But in between the sets, there's calm, right? There's time for reset. There's time for rest. There's time for reflection. So, I wrote down between sets, there's calm, and that is the reset, and that could look at emotions, opportunity, and energy all move in waves, right? Like, there's going to be opportunities in life that you're going to see that are going to come. And some of them are going to feel like they're coming a lot at once, right? And then there's going to be periods where I feel like nothing's coming at all, right? And you might just be in between a set. You might just be in a down cycle. I think about this cycle with like investing and financial stuff, right? If you look at the stock markets, you look at real estate, you look at everything is on a cycle. And if you pay attention to history and you understand cycle and you understand the laws of nature, you understand that those cycles have high periods and low periods. And you might be in a really, really high period, and just understand that might not last forever. So by being mentally prepared or physically prepared or whatever preparation is needed for that situation in the analogy that we're using, understand that if you're prepared for it, the downturn is not as volatile. It's not as impactful negatively, emotionally. But also on the opposite scenario, if you're in a down cycle, understand it's going to turn around. It's going to turn around. It's going to come back up. And like I said, that time depends on what we're talking about, because cycles have micro and macro cycles. There's immediate things that happen right away. An episode that I really thought about talking about, which, is kind of a little bit of this conversation, was like the ability to zoom in and zoom out of life, right? Like, when you zoom in life, things look very volatile. When you zoom out of life, you realize that, like, things are not necessarily linear, but they're close to linear, right? But you have to zoom out far enough to see what that growth looks like, what the growth of humanity looks like, what the growth of technology has done, what the growth of you as an individual do. I think about this with obviously with my job with weight loss for clients, right? They might be weighing themselves weekly or twice a month or monthly, and they might not feel like they're seeing a lot of progress fast, right? They might feel like, I'm doing all this work, I'm spending all this money, I'm spending all this time and energy, and I don't feel like I'm seeing the ROI. And the reality is, like, you didn't put that weight on that fast, and you're also not going to lose it that fast, right? Unless you're, doing some peptides or some GLPs, then obviously things can move a little faster. But for the most of us that are doing it, quote unquote, the natural way, then, like, yeah, it's slow. But if you were to zoom out and, like, oh, look what happened over a course of a year, or look what happened over the course of 6 months, or look what happened over the course of a decade, with consistent routine, you can see that those things actually change in a very positive way. So that's the ability to understand the rhythm of life, right? Next one, trees bend in storms, rigid ones snap. Flexibility as a survival skill. I would say, out of all things in business and all things in my even athletic career, I've always looked at the ability to adapt as a superpower, right? Adaptability is going to be one of those things that I think is really the thing that's going to allow you to continually grow through life, because without adaptation, well, A, that's what makes humans humans, right? Like, this is the most beautiful thing about being a human, right? When I talk about training to people, like, we're provided a stimulus, right? And that stimulus is obviously lifting weights or becoming faster with your runs or becoming more mobile or flexible. And that adaptation to that stimulus is what's going to get you stronger or more flexible or faster, right? And that stimulus that happens in life, if I were to give you an analogy for life, is you're getting stimulus through life, right? You're getting challenged emotionally, right? At home, or you're getting challenged, mentally at work, right? Or you're getting challenged in different situations. And those are stimuluses, right? And that stimuli requires adaptation. And with the proper adaptation, you will grow, right? So that flexibility is really a big superpower because that's a survival skill for life. Your roots are what's holding you down, right? So when I say, and not holding you down in a good way, not holding you back in a bad way. So these are your values, these are your relationships, these are your health, right? So if you think about the analogy, like the roots are the thing that keep us centered, right? Yes, in storms or disasters, and I keep throwing up my quotations. So for those that are seeing this on YouTube, you see me doing this live. If you're listening to this, just remember there's a lot of quotations being thrown around for my analogies. And I put branches break, right? Like, you're going to lose some of the small shit every once in a while. You're going to lose some of the shit at the top, the superficial crap. But what you're not going to lose, and what you're always need to come back to, and what you always need to remember your why on, is your roots. It's your foundation. It's your why. It's the thing that keeps you grounded. It's the thing that keeps you here. And that's the thing that's always going to keep us upright, because if we always come back to what our roots are and not our branches are, that we can just really kind of focus on growth. So storms expose what's deep-rooted is what I wrote down. 6, rivers always find a way. Water does not force itself. It flows downstream. Consistency carves canyons. I love this, right? What's the good old Bruce Lee? Be like water, right? Be like water, flow like water. So when you think about life, right, you can choose to go through force. You can choose to fight the current, or you can choose to leverage the current. You can choose to go with the flow. For me, I would say one of the things that I've always thought about being just like a superpower for my ability to get along with a lot of people or put myself in different situations is like, I'm cool with going with the flow. Like, there ain't no restaurant that I'm going to be like, don't want to go here. It ain't going to be a thing that I'm like, don't really want to do that. For the most part, 99% of the time, I will be like, cool, let's do whatever. So just flow, right? Understand that like flowing and going with the currents is an ability to just relax, is an ability to just trust the process, is an ability to understand that like life has its reasoning for why it's taking you certain ways, right? And no matter what you believe in, the universe or believe in your God, whatever that might be, that I'm not here to tell you what you believe in. I'll always have kind of come back to like, there is a reason why I'm here. There is a reason why this happened. There's a reason for everything, right? Because what I use that kind of response towards things in life for is because that reasoning or that approach is allowed me to just trust, right? Allowed me to kind of just relax, because every time I try to force myself wherever, every time I try to quote unquote go against the currents, I exhaust myself and I burn out, and I realize that that's not right for me, right? And there's some things in life that I realize that when I'm not doing it in a 100% alignment for what I want out of life, I'm quote unquote going against the current, right? So trusting the process, going with the flow, trusting the current, understanding that we are going to operate through life with flow, and we're not going to operate through life with force, right? So that's number 6. Number 7, animals know when to hibernate. Rest is productive. I wrote down humans are the only species that feels bad for resting. Growth hormone, if I were to give you a little like actual thing, is like growth hormone released during sleep and muscles rebuild during rest. When I was younger, used to think that like rest was like for the weak. It's like, like the famous quote, just you got to keep pushing. You got to keep going through it. You don't need to recover. If I take a day off, I'm losing muscle. If I take a day off of work, I'm going to lose the business. As I've gotten older, as I've gotten matured, as I've gotten more educated, I've learned to just understand that no, this is a cycle that allows me to, I use this analogy all the time for myself that like life has this slingshot effect with so many things. Like there's going to be periods in your life where you feel like you're actually getting pulled backwards and going the wrong direction, but then you realize that it's actually a slingshot pulling you backwards, right? They're like that tension of pulling you backwards is what's allowing you to propel forward 10x, 5x, 2x, whatever you're doing in life. And animals understand this. Like when a bear goes into hibernation, it doesn't fight it. It just understands that this is the process of life. This is my time to sleep. And I think about this with like sleep. I always as a kid, my mom and dad used to always say that, like, you were just a kid that needs its sleep, right? I need 7, 8, 9, 10 hours of sleep. And then as I started to get in my teenage years and I started to get in my early 20s, and that was a mixture of partying and going out all the time, I was like, fuck that. You don't need that crap. Like, you don't need to sleep. You can keep operating. And now, I got back into my mid 20s and then I started going back to this. Like, now I'm like, I need to sleep like a minimum of 7 hours, but ideally 8 to 9 hours a day. Some people can operate with 6 or 7 hours. Some people can operate with 4 or 5 hours. I see a lot of business influencers and business people that I follow, and even just workshops that I've gone to with business. And these guys, I wake up at 4 a.m. because early bird gets the worm and I get started. Like, guess what? That doesn't fucking work for me. I don't want to set an alarm clock to go build this thing. I'd much rather just operate by feel. I'd much rather go with the flow, right? And for me, it's like if I feel better sleeping in and not having an alarm clock, and that's my idea of like work-life balance, and that's my idea of an optimal life, then I'm going to do that. I don't need to put myself in a different bucket. I don't need to create a separate avatar for who I want to be. It's like, be who I am, and I can accomplish the goals by staying in that identity. I don't need to create this new identity. Now, don't get me wrong. There's context to that statement for some of us. But like for most of us, it's like when you can learn to live in the alignment, you can learn to understand that that's just part of the process. It's different. Okay, number 8, ecosystems thrive through their interdependence, right? So nothing survives alone. Even apex predators, survive off the food chain. Trees share nutrients through the fungal roots, which is like understanding that like we all have our little ecosystems. We all have things that we're codependent on, right? And I'm a very independent person, the way that I would kind of explain myself to most people. Like, I like my independence. I like my alone time. I was in Vegas a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. And I was gone for 6 a.m. Tuesday to 10 p.m. What is that? So I was gone for like 40 hours, 36 hours, whatever it was. Not long at all. It felt long because I was away from my wife, I was away from my work, and I was, with new people for 16 hours and flying in airports and all that crap. But I realized when I was alone in the airport on that last day and I was about to fly back home that I was like, man, this was actually like recharging for me. My wife in the beginning of our relationship, she used to have a hard time with that understanding. She's like, that's like, she used to always view my idea of being alone of like, I don't want to be around her. And to a degree, obviously I can understand how that makes sense because like, that's exactly what it sounds like. What she's learned and what she's gotten so much better at, which is important for me, is like that alone time for me, and it doesn't take much, or that independent time allows me to fill my cup, right? So it allows me to go back and go fill my cup for her, fill my cup for my team, fill my cup for my clients, work on my business on the back end, be proactive on these other things. But I have such a big ecosystem that fuels me as well, right? Like I don't run alone all the time, right? I need periods of being alone. I need a little bit of a break. I need a little bit of a deload. I need a little bit of a vacation. But like I am codependent on so many other people for what I do in life. Like I always think about this. I'm like, I don't know how the fuck I used to live alone, like without my wife. I don't know how I used to work when I was an independent contractor training like clients alone and going to a gym. It's like, it was just very lonely. And I realized that like life is codependent on itself. Life has this ecosystem that we all feed each other. And when you can learn to understand that, you can learn to collaborate versus be competitive, right? And like being competitive is part of my nature, but collaboration is greater than competition, right? And it's like I can grow much faster, exponentially faster when I learn to collaborate, right? When I learn to understand that there's an ecosystem that's fed. So those are the 8 that I wrote down. The last thing I wrote down was just kind of like a bonus. And this bonus, when I say bonus, is there are parts of life that I think are brutal, right? And when I say brutal, physically, emotionally, mentally, there's just so many things in life that we're all going to go through that are fucking hard, right? And they're just emotionally hard, physically hard, like I said. And I wrote down is nature is brutal, right? But I also wrote down it's loving in different ways, right? Like I think, once again, out of all these things that are listed off, there's parallels to all of them, right? But I use the word the line nature is brutal as a reminder a lot, right? Because like my wife, for example, is super empathetic, has a hard time seeing people suffer, seeing people be in certain situations. And I do too, but to a very less degree than she does, right? I'm able to just kind of compartmentalize what's going on outside of the world versus what's going on inside of my world. But I also have an understanding that nature is brutal, right? Like if I were to think about this reality of like, we have a very civilized life, right? And I know some people will disagree with this just because some people choose to play victim and think everything's a shit show. But like I always think about this 1,000 years ago. Think about this before we had homes. Think about before we had governments and structure and roads and laws and rules and order and things that, ideally most of these things, if you try to be optimistic about it, weren't created for the worst. They were created in a way to hopefully create some level of control and structure for people. Because the reality of it is most people need structure. Most people need guidelines. Most people need a sense of direction. Most people need a roadmap. But if you were to just rewind however long ago, life was pretty fucking brutal, right? And nature is brutal still today, right? Like, if you see how animals have to survive, right? They think about the ability that they have to go hunt other species in the kingdom. Some of them have to hunt each other to just live and survive. Some of them have to create homes that get lost through natural disasters. It creates a level of empathy for me because I understand the reality of fucking shit is hard and shit is brutal. That doesn't mean that I'm just accepted the fate that okay, I don't want to help, I don't want to fight it. But I do have an understanding that the reality of life is there is different cultures, there is different communities, there is different people, there are different genders, there are different things in life that will create hardship if you look at their way of living, right? And we all have a different way of living. We all have a different upbringing, right? And that can be brutal, right? And I kind of put that as a little bonus point because I like to remind people of that, right? But I also like to look at the other side that nature is loving, right? Nature is full of great things, right? Nature is not one of the things, I would say my wife's the most beautiful. The second thing is nature is the most beautiful thing that I've ever looked at. Every time I'm outside, doesn't matter. For me, it's filling my cup. I like to just go to the beach and I'll sit down and just stare. Doesn't matter if I'm laying down, tanning, thinking on the beach and just absorbing it, or if I'm actually awake, visually just looking at it. Every time I'm mountain biking, every time I'm surfing, every time I'm at a beach, I'm my God, it's just Lake Tahoe is one of my favorite places. Santa Cruz is one of my favorite places. I live in one of the most beautiful areas in the world, which is why I pay so much fucking goddamn money to live here. But it is a beautiful place. It's a beautiful thing. So understand the yin to the yang, right? Understand that there's two sides to that coin. But if you can learn to understand the laws of how they operate, I think the framing changes a little bit where there's a little bit of a degree of empathy, but degree of acceptance as well, right? That we're not going to be able to control everything. And some of these things are out of our control because that's just how nature works. Nature is always adapting. It's always evolving and it's always growing. And so should you, right? So don't get stuck because that's not how nature works. All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed any of that hippie insight as always. So if you liked it, share it with somebody, like it, review it. I actually, I was thinking about this the other day. Leave a review on the podcast for me, guys. If you feel like you guys have been following this stuff for a long time, I probably have done over 150, maybe 180 episodes. It helps me know that you guys care. I love when I get feedback in the gym, and I love when I get responses. So help you boy out.